I'm Sarah Jackson, and this is Internal Comms Pro, the podcast. We're getting the gears turning as we talk to the experts on our ever-changing world of internal communications. This season, we're shifting the mindset.
So one of the things to keep in mind is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a one-size-fits-all. So it really depends on the organization, its maturity level, if you will, whether it's at the undeveloped stage or whether it's at the advanced stage. I like to encourage and even challenge individuals to start at the top. Because if your plan does not have leadership buy-in, it's going to be, in the end, ineffective. It's imperative to establish transparency in the process.
DEI, a subject that is important now more than ever. Over the past year, dozens of companies have tried to expand their DEI efforts to be a more inclusive workplace, with varying results. Or maybe your company hasn't started any DEI efforts, but you see that the need is there. What can you do to lead the charge, or at least bring your thoughts to the rest of your company? Well, our guest for this episode is Robin Shabazz, founder of the Eastledge Group, which offers cultural-based counseling for organizations. With her years of experience, Robin has seen many successes and failures when companies try to implement diversity measures. We'll be going back to the basics as Robin breaks down what DEI truly means for you and your company.
So my name is Robin Shabazz, and I am a DEI professional. I work for and own, actually, the Eastledge Group, and we're a management consulting firm that specializes in helping individuals and organizations develop cultural intelligence, which is a fancy way of saying we help you develop the skills that you need to be more effective working in our ever-growing multicultural world. And we are based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am proud to say that we are a woman-owned minority firm.
Well, that was the end. That's a show-stopping intro. I am so giddy. I didn't know you were my neighbor. I live in Northern Kentucky. So this is wonderful that you're right here. So first of all, if you feel comfortable in today's day and age, we got to go out and meet. Second of all, the fact that you own this company as a female entrepreneur and owner, super excited. And third, the fact that you know something about this topic, because our listeners, we always go out and ask our listeners, all right, what do you want to hear about? And this is one of the topics that is always in the top, 5 things that they're needing and they're wanting, and they're finding themselves in interesting positions of how do I lead this, being kind of where they sit in the organization. So I can't thank you enough. So before we kind of jump into all of this, I want to just back up, and can you teach us about, are we saying this word right? Is it DEI?
So one of the things to keep in mind is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a one-size-fits-all. So it really depends on the organization, its maturity level, if you will, whether it's at the undeveloped stage or whether it's at the advanced stage. So organizations really find the title of this practice based upon where they are in their own internal culture. So there's not really one way of describing the work. What's important to note is that there are unique differences between each of the key terms, whether you call it inclusion and diversity and equity, or you call it diversity, equity, inclusion. We hope you don't call it diversity, inclusion, and equity, because that acronym is DEI, and we don't want that. So when we think of diversity, we really think of everyone's immutable differences and lived experiences, right? So we are all individuals with diverse backgrounds. So diversity speaks to everyone. It's not just the BIPOC population, and that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, which it's often attributed to. So there's 7 billion people in the world, and we all are have diverse backgrounds. And so inclusion is really about how we embrace everyone's differences and their lived experiences by giving them a seat at the table and valuing their contributions, creating a sense of belonging. And equity is about how do we hold each other accountable for dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality in an organization. So that really speaks to your practices, your policies, your procedures. So when they're taken all together, you can see that they nicely fit, but they each carry its own distinct meaning, and they all need to happen in an organization because organization, you can be diverse and certainly not inclusive, and you can have diversity and inclusion but not have equity. So I'm really pleased with how this space has matured in recognizing that we need all three.
Mm. Well, you so beautifully, I think, educated our listeners on that. And I want to make sure we capture this in the show notes because just for the internal communicator to be able to articulate so beautifully what you just did is powerful. Like these are each three separate kind of buckets, but people put them all together, which is interesting. Which I think it's good that people can come to you to help facilitate this, because God, that was beautiful of how you explain that. Now, I want to go back to something here. You talked about it depends on a company's maturity level. So, one of the things our listeners are struggling with here is they, in their heart and themselves, feel very passionate about this topic. And then they try to go take that flag up the hill. And God love them, right? If we're not well versed in this, which is why we need to go to folks like you, then sometimes they meet resistance, right? And and so if what advice would you give to our listeners? How do they assess their company's maturity level? And if the company is immature, is this something they should even go take on by themselves?
It's interesting that you ask how do they assess, because it's almost like, looking at in the mirror and saying that, you're not attractive, right? So we see each other every single day, but how do others see us? So it's hard to really make that internal assessment. However, it's easy to say we're in the undeveloped stages when we really haven't started anything at all. And I like to tell my clients that you know that you're beginning when you start to say, okay, we want to perhaps have a DEI program, or we want to launch employee resource groups, which are groups formed around certain affinities, whether it's culture or race or gender identity or sexual preference or orientation rather, or it's veteran status, all of these different affinity groups. Organizations often start with things like that, which are seen as low hanging fruit and not a lot of ruffling feathers to start with things like that. They often start with educational programs. Those types of organizations are usually at the beginning stages. And then you begin to get in the what I would call the intermediate stage. And that is when you're beginning to put the plan in place. You actually have a strategic plan where diversity, equity, inclusion isn't this program, but you really see it as a competitive advantage. And so you begin to develop plans and actions and objectives around your DEI strategy, just like you would around any other business strategy. And then when you're in the advanced stage, that is when it is culturally embedded. in your organization. And culture is the that's the cream de la creme, right? Because this good old saying from Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I know. So by the time you get to the advanced stage, you have your strategy in place. You have the culture that's going to support it.
If I am the internal communicator, giving where I sit in the organization, what advice do you have to our listener? Where do they start to go down this road? If they feel like, because they might not be in a leadership position, but more than ever now they are seen as leaders in their companies. If I come to you and say, Robin, where do I begin, given where I sit in the organization? What advice would you have for us?
Well, I go for the juggler here. I am really because contrary to what many people believe, launching a DEI plan doesn't begin with an education program or an affinity group. Even though many of them begin that way, it's almost like if you begin that way, you're always going to be pushing this 2-ton boulder up a hill. I like to encourage and even challenge individuals to start at the top, because if your plan does not have leadership buy-in, it's going to be in the end ineffective. And I call this the teeth at the top, right? This is where you have clear accountability. And that accountability comes from senior leaders. Senior leaders understand and recognize that it's a company priority. Now, not all of us have intrinsic motivation for this. Some of us may be extrinsically motivated. Our customers and our clients demand it. Our new hires, the millennials and the Gen Zs, who are the most diverse generation in our history, demand it. So I don't care if your motivation is extrinsic or if it's intrinsic. We have to tap into that motivation for senior leadership. We have to find that carrot on the stick for them so that they're bought in, they hold everyone accountable, and they begin to set the tone at the top, which means that we not only talk about DEI, but we walk that talk. We connect DEI to our values, our mission, our strategic plan, how we communicate both inside and outside the organization. That's the real work of DEI. It's not programmatic, it is ultimately cultural. It's almost like you want to build it right. Otherwise, you're building your house on quicksand.
That's so good. So based on your experience, is that where communicators have tend to stumble when trying to implement something into their culture? Is they go for programming and education, and they don't, like you said, I love that, go for the jugular. That's awesome. Break that down for me. Do I go through to the jugular with data, or how do I do that and find out what the motivation is?
I like to, challenge people to think of DEI just like any other strategy or plan or end game that you want senior leadership to support. So, what do you have to do? You have to put yourselves in their shoes, right? And so, what is going to resonate most strongly with your C-suite, your senior leaders? Is it their reputation? They want to be seen as a leader in this in the community. They don't want to be shamed as being the only one who hasn't started down this journey. When we had this world outcry after the George Floyd murder, or could it be that it's related to bottom line? I have clients whose customers are asking them, what are your DEI what does your DEI plan look like? What can I see your demographics? What's your demographic makeup? So it could be motivated by acquiring new business. It could be motivated by retention. We have organizations that we know for a fact, and the data demonstrates that diversity, equity, inclusion is a retention lever. So perhaps you're seeing that there's more turnover than desired. So it behooves us to really approach our senior leaders with what keeps them up at night and how does DEI help to resolve that?
I love that. So, when you're working, have you can you give us insight? We always like to exchange notes, among communicators. Have you worked with any, smart whippersnappers? Like, oh, I had this one client and this person, let me tell you what they did. Any, examples of folks doing this that we can learn from? And on the flip side, anybody that you work with that had an epic failure, like, hey, don't do this because the greatest learnings, come from the failures. Can you share anything like that?
Sure. I can think of just, right off the top, one particular client organization that really was at the undeveloped stage. Are a primarily female based organization. Their workforce is primarily female. However, their leadership is primarily male. They are nearly homogeneous. They are probably 88% white, and they reside in the Bible Belt, if you will. So, very conservative views. So, not a lot of diversity, and certainly a culture that could be seen by some as not being as inclusive. So they embarked on this DEI journey, literally starting from the ground, working their way up. And what I love about this client, because we're still working together, is that the initial conversations that I had with them was with the CEO and with the chairman of the board. They recognized that this was a business imperative for them because they could not continue to brand themselves as this industry leader and not speak about diversity, equity, inclusion because their clients were speaking about it externally as well as internally. That type of client, I have to admit, is often few and far between. However, we can connect the dots for them because I can guarantee you that the numbers are going to speak for themselves, whether you're looking at how the community looks at you or how your customers or clients look at you or how you ultimately internally are looking at your own workforce and getting those demands from your internal workforce. So by looking at your numbers, by looking at those motivators, we can help leaders connect the dots. So this organization was incredibly successful because they started with that teeth at the top. Started with the CEO and the chairman of the board.
We'll be back with our talk with Robin after a word from our sponsor. Your workforce is full of incredible people. People who come from different backgrounds, different races, speak different languages. As an internal communicator, you get the chance to make sure your employees' unique stories and experiences are shared in an inclusive way. Circle Broadcast creates a personalized cross-channel experience for each of your diverse, dispersed workforce. Head on over to circle.com/ICP. That's CERKL.com/ICP to learn more about how you can broadcast your employee stories in an impactful way. Welcome back. In this next part, we break down how to get a pulse on your workforce and how to keep credibility on the changes that employees want to make. Now let's jump back in. Well, I want that story to come out because I want our listeners to believe, like, yes, you got to think strategically here. Don't stumble and that's why I want to get to your other story of what was an epic fail, because I want them to learn. But so many of them, I think, are fatigued and weary, and they're like, am I going to be able to make a difference on this thing? I'm so tired anyway. And but yet they are they're internally conflicted about it, so they don't know what to do. So that's why I'm like, yes, you can do something, but you gotta be smart, and you gotta listen to Robin. So tell me about one of those epic failures. What did we learn there?
So, unfortunately, I do see these epic failures more frequently. And that's okay because we fall down, but we get up. So, what I typically see are there's usually a couple of things in common with clients who have that epic fail. One is that they use performative statements about whether it's about allyship, whether it's about anti-racism, to share their company's commitment to DEI. However, there's no action inside the organization to back it up. And it fails from the inside out because employees see through that. And believe it or not, there are a lot of organizations out there that jumped on the bandwagon after George Floyd's murder and had all of these wonderful statements out there. And their employees were saying, yeah, but that's not really how it is inside the organization.
Yeah, then it does more harm than good at that point.
Then it does more harm than good. Exactly. And because then you have to back up and rebuild the trust. Yes. So that definitely is a stumbling block. And the other thing that I see as a big stumbling block is when we make DEI about a certain group of people and to the exclusion of others, right? Or where we shame other people. And that's why I was very clear in the beginning when we define diversity, because we all have diverse backgrounds. We all have a different lived experience that we can bring to the table. Not one human has the same background and experience. So everyone can benefit from what DEI is all about. We are all diverse. We all want to be included. We all want to feel like we belong. And we all desire fairness in decision making when it comes to our careers. So don't make this about one or two or three specific groups.
I love that. And I feel like the communicator that can help leadership communicate what you just said is the greatest place to start. And I want the listeners to hear that they have the power. I mean, they just feel like, man, they got the pen and they got the power of the pen to help get this thing, started off on the right foot. If people did start on the wrong foot, to as you said, and they're not getting the results, and they have tripped up already, what are some steps to course correct, and to make some of those changes that they need to make to get the train back on the tracks and going in the right direction?
Well, one thing that it's always good to do is to survey your workforce. Oftentimes we get out the gate, we're gun ho, we've done a little research, maybe we have benchmark even, and we're doing some things that have worked in other organizations and they just didn't work in our organization. What I like to tell my clients in those instances is, what is your workforce saying to you? So one of the first things that I ask is, besides for and during data collection, is let me see what your demographic makeup is, and let me see what your latest employee opinion survey or employee engagement survey, what are employees saying about this culture? What are the pluses and minuses? And if they don't have one, then I want them to start with that. Because the best way to get leadership's attention, because again, it always needs to start with the teeth at the top, is to go to them with their own data. Here's what our employees want and need. Here's what they're saying is going to make this a best place to work. Here's what they're saying is going to make them stay. Here's what they're saying is going to make them tell other people about our company. and then work from that data.
Gosh, that's so good. And do you give guidance on, I would imagine, again, from the internal communicator perspective, there's such power in the process to communicate what you're doing and the intention behind it all along the way, because then you can get wins and capitalize on, yes, we haven't got the results yet, but I would think there's an opportunity here for the communicator to be capitalizing on the power of the process. Any guidance there of you've seen people do that effectively, or do you advise them of communicating the process along the way?
Absolutely. It's imperative to establish transparency in the process upfront. And it's no different than any other major organizational endeavor where people are at the center of it, because people are at the center of DEI work, because at the heart of it, it's cultural work. So you want their opinion, and you want to ensure that they're kept updated and that they're able to participate. So there's no better way to ensure that that's happening than through transparent communication. So it comes in a myriad of different ways. I see organizations with what they may call fireside chats, or the all hands on deck meetings, where the communicators work with the executive leadership team, and they share what's going on from the executives. Again, it's the tone at the top, right? I see it through newsletters, internal newsletters. I see it through their intranet. I see it through their website. So the important thing is that it's woven throughout all of your internal and external communication. And it's easy to do that when your department leaders, when your senior team are bought in, and you're able to connect it to what matters most to them.
Now, Robin, you have your own podcast. Please say yes. If you don't, you need to start your own,
I
because
do
this is,
not.
oh my gracious. And you're like,
It's on my list. It's on my list.
so if people want to connect with you, do you mind if we kind of put out your LinkedIn? How do they get in touch with you if they want to get started? I'd love to toss, listeners again to a gal next door here in my hometown too. That would make me happy. How can we get in touch with you?
Absolutely. I don't mind you sharing my LinkedIn. Absolutely. My website is www.theeastledgegroup.com, and they can contact me via my website, and I even have a free 20-minute consultation so we can at least get the conversation started.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll make sure we put that in the show notes. I can't thank you enough for giving us a heads up here with some pitfalls, where to start, what to do. I want our listeners to be set up for success and to get started off on the right foot. As you said, not to start a program, but before they embark on this journey, to be a little bit wiser of how to do it to get, the end result, to your point, of that they're looking for. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It was such a surprise to hear that Robin is in my backyard. As we continued our conversation, I thought about how freeing it was to allow myself to be open to Robin's advice. When we're willing to listen and shift our mindset, we see how opportunities make themselves known. You might be a little nervous about taking that next step in your DEI measures. Maybe you're afraid of your efforts failing. Even so, allow yourself to listen, be flexible, and at the end of the day, make sure you call folks like Robin. We've got experts all around us. There might be one in your backyard. Now, don't go away just yet. We have a new segment featuring our good friends from Ragan's Communications Leadership Council on how you can use today's episode learnings right now. Let's tune in.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm Mandy Zaransky-Hurst, Chief Operating Officer at Ragan Communications and Head of Ragan's Leadership Councils. Today I'm here with Peg Cates, Director of Global Employee Communications at SAP. Thanks for being here, Peg.
Thanks for having me, Mandy. Nice to be here.
Peg, let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your role at SAP before we dive into DEI.
And to your point, DEI is one of the things, it's a kind of a personal passion as well as professional one. So it's really an amazing thing when those things can come together. But my journey's been a long one at SAP, and I'm very proud of that. I've been with the company, the first time about 3.5 years, and then came back and have been back now for 18 plus years. And it's because of our commitment to things like social causes and diversity and inclusion that I think I felt like this was a place I wanted to be for really the bulk of my career. So I've been in communications roles at SAP globally for many, many years, have had the opportunity to reinvent myself here multiple times. One of those iterations was as head of comms for diversity and inclusion, and I think SAP was really showing its commitment to that.
So, Peg, you had said that your comms team works hand in glove with the DEI team, but can you talk a little bit more about how the comms team is involved in DEI?
Sure. Again, we do have a global diversity and inclusion office, and that has an entire staff, including a comms person. But those folks can't do it alone, right? I mean, diversity and inclusion is not the responsibility of one office or one group or one set of folks. It certainly is something that involves every employee at every level. So it's exciting for us that as an employee comms team, we're constantly supporting, promoting, amplifying what the comms team is able to do from the diversity and inclusion side, and combining that with our HR communications people and our sustainability communications people and our global health communications people. These aren't things that exist in a vacuum. These are things that all have to come together, and every employee at every level, from the board on down, has to have a personal commitment if we're really going to make any kind of progress.
So, what advice do you have on how a comms team, maybe one that isn't quite as far evolved as SAP's, how can a comms team become DEI champions?
Well, it starts with one step, right? I mean, this is, let's face it, DEI is a journey, a long journey. And that road is not straight. It moves and it changes. There's detours, there's roadblocks, there's traffic jams. But I think when folks are able to take one step together and move in the right direction, that is progress, right? So I think what we do is try to support any of the work that's being done at the Global Diversity and Inclusion Office level, and then take it and amplify it out to all 104,000 plus employees at SAP globally. So whether it's a program or a project or an initiative or a town hall, we are helping to take what this small but mighty diversity and inclusion team does and amplify it out through all of the channels at our disposal, from a global employee communications perspective, to make sure that all employees are aware of the efforts. We also are the employee comms team is responsible for things like our global all hands meetings, and that's where the entire board of SAP, gives an update on what's happening in the business. And it's really amazing to me how every single one of those meetings, and there's quarterly meetings, and then there are other town halls and all hands that happen throughout the year. There is a diversity and inclusion topic on the table for every one of those meetings. So we try and really make sure that D&I is not being put in a little pocket, right, in a little bucket. We try and take that and spread it like grains of sand across the entire beach.
It's so important to try and amplify as many of the stories as you can. How do you get some of the stories to come to you? Certainly, you're amplifying the work that the global DEI team is doing, but not all of the stories go directly to them. It's possible that stories come to your team and then you share them further. How do some of those stories get to you?
There's lots of ways. As I said, we're not a siloed organization, which is nice. So certainly, reaching out directly and talking on a regular basis to our communications colleagues around the world helps us to gather those kinds of stories and again help to amplify them when they're told by different groups, in different parts of the world. But we also, we have a just amazingly robust employee network within SAP. So, what are often referred to as employee resource groups or employee network groups. SAP has over 80 of those globally. And so oftentimes people bring their stories to us, whether it's to a communicator that they happen to know, or it is told through a particular employee network group or employee resource group. And then we often pick up that story and run with it. So, how do we turn that into a news story, whether it's that is only shared within the SAP community or outside of the SAP community through all of the social media channels at our disposal. So much of what we do is just networking amongst each other, telling each other what's going on. We talk on a monthly, if not bi-weekly basis to our counterparts across the world. So we're not shy about sharing those kinds of stories. And if anything, sometimes we're able to shine a bigger light on it by raising it up and getting it in front of senior executives that want to amplify that story through town hall meetings, through newsletters, through global all hands meetings. So there's so many different channels where we can share information, and we're not the least bit hesitant about saying, hey, I've got this great story that needs to be told. I can only get it to a limited amount of people, but can you help me amplify it to the world? And so we work really collaboratively, which is a nice thing.
Well, it certainly sounds like it. The way in which you speak about SAP and their focus on all things related to employee wellness, safety, health, and DEI are quite remarkable. Thank you so much for being with us today, Peg. We appreciate it.
A huge thank you to our sponsor, Ragan, Mandy Zarinsky-Hurst, and our featured guests for being a part of our new segment. If you're interested in more information about Ragan's Communications Leadership Council, an exclusive membership for senior-level communicators and their entire communications teams, please go to commscouncil@ragan.com. Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is also proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective. Don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.